Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the Soviet Union. What do you see? Gray concrete apartment blocks, breadlines, stern Lenin portraits, military parades with goose-stepping soldiers and nuclear missiles, the KGB lurking in shadows, Siberian gulags where prisoners freeze. That's what they taught you, isn't it? And here's the thing, it's all real. They all happened. But what if I told you that's only 3% of the story? What if I told you that in 1959, Soviet citizens were drinking more Pepsi than Americans? That the USSR invented the first artificial heart, the first mobile phone, and the first video game console? That there was a secret Soviet jazz underground that would make prohibition speakeasies look tame? That cosmonauts carried shotguns into space not for aliens, but for bears? Tonight, I want to tell you about the Soviet Union they never taught you in school. Not the cartoon villain version, but the strange, contradictory, utterly human reality of 70 years that shaped our modern world. The real Soviet Union was so much stranger and more fascinating than anything you were taught. It was a place where impossible things happened daily, where the future and the medieval past collided, where some of the 20th century's greatest scientific achievements happened alongside some of its darkest horrors, where you could be arrested for owning the wrong book, but could also get a free university education that would rival MIT. The Soviet Union was both the system that produced Sputnik and the system that created the Holodomor. It gave us Tetris and Tankman. It was simultaneously decades ahead and decades behind. So tonight, I'm going to share 101 facts about Soviet history that will completely change how you understand the 20th century. Not dry dates and statistics, but the human stories, the bizarre details, the secrets that were buried for decades. Some of these stories will make you laugh, some will break your heart, some will seem too strange to be true, but I promise you, they are, because reality, especially Soviet reality, was always stranger than fiction. Welcome to the real Soviet Union. Trust me, you've never seen anything like it. History pivots on tiny moments. April 1917. Vladimir Lenin was in exile in Switzerland, desperate to get back to Russia, where revolution was brewing. The problem? World War I was raging, and there was no easy way to cross Europe. Enter an unlikely helper, the German military. They arranged for a sealed train to carry him across Germany. But Lenin, paranoid about being captured or assassinated, almost refused. He spent 3 days debating with his wife Krupskaya whether to take the risk. Finally, she told him, "If you don't go, someone else will make the revolution without you." That sentence changed the 20th century. Lenin boarded the train, and within months had seized power. Everything that followed the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the space race, hinged on that one decision. When the Bolsheviks took power, they didn't just want political change. They wanted to rebuild humanity from scratch. So they created the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment, headed by Anatoly Lunacharsky, who believed art and culture could transform human consciousness. In the chaos of 1918, while civil war raged and people starved, he was commissioning avant-garde operas and funding experimental art collectives. And here's the weird part. It kind of worked. For a brief moment, in the early 1920s, Soviet culture exploded with creativity. Artists like Kandinsky and Chagall created revolutionary masterpieces. Poets like Mayakovsky wrote verses that made crowds weep. Filmmakers like Eisenstein invented techniques still used today. In the 1920s, some Bolshevik theorists argued that the traditional family was bourgeois and should be dismantled. Alexandra Kollontai advocated for free love and communal child-rearing. Her vision: children would be raised by the collective, not individual parents. Several communes experimented with this. Children called all adults mother and father. Romantic relationships were fluid and temporary. It was radical social engineering on a scale never attempted before. The experiment failed spectacularly. Turns out humans are deeply attached to their families. By the 1930s, Stalin had reversed course entirely, declaring the family a cornerstone of Soviet society. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to eliminate religion, they wanted to replace it. Instead of baptism, there was the Octobering ceremony, where babies were given a red star. Instead of weddings, there were red weddings, where couples pledged loyalty to each other and to communism simultaneously. They even created Soviet saints, revolutionary martyrs, whose stories were told with religious fervor. Icons of Lenin replaced icons of Christ. The strangest part: some of it worked. Many Soviet citizens developed genuine emotional attachments to these rituals. Victory Day on May 9th became, and remains, a sacred holiday. In the 1920s, many Bolsheviks believed nationalism and language barriers were tools of oppression. The solution: a universal language that would unite all workers. They tried to improve Esperanto and make it mandatory across the USSR. Thousands of schools taught Esperanto. International conferences were held in it. There was even an Esperanto language Soviet radio station. The dream was that, within a generation, everyone from Moscow to Vladivostok would speak this new tongue. It didn't work. Turns out language is deeply tied to identity in ways that can't be engineered away. Here's something that makes Western history uncomfortable. The Soviet Union gave women rights in 1918 that American women wouldn't get for decades. Full voting rights, equal pay for equal work, guaranteed maternity leave, the right to divorce, the right to keep their own names after marriage, access to abortion, protection from workplace discrimination. Alexandra Kollontai became the world's first female government minister. By the 1920s, women made up a significant portion of Soviet doctors, engineers, and scientists. Unthinkable in the West at the time. Was this perfect? Absolutely not. Women still did most housework. Many professions remained male-dominated. But the legal framework was revolutionary. American women couldn't even open a bank account without their husband's permission until 1960. Soviet women were performing surgery and designing bridges in the 1920s. The young pioneers weren't just Soviet Boy Scouts. They were a massive youth movement that, at its peak, included almost every Soviet child aged 10 to 15. And here's the surprising thing: most kids loved it. Pioneers got to wear red neckerchiefs, attend summer camps on lakes and mountains, learn skills from survival techniques to radio operation. They competed in sports, performed in talent shows, went on adventures. Pioneer palaces in major cities were like combination community centers, museums, and amusement parks. Kids could take free classes in everything, from astronomy to ballet. They could join robotics clubs or drama troupes. For many Soviet children, especially those from rural areas, the pioneers opened up worlds they never knew existed. Before Stalin clamped down in the 1930s, Soviet cities had a thriving jazz scene that rivaled anything in America. The Bolsheviks initially saw jazz as revolutionary music, the sound of African Americans resisting oppression. Jazz clubs opened in Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet musicians formed bands and played wild improvisational sets. Then Stalin decided jazz was decadent Western influence, and the scene went underground. But it never completely died. Even in the darkest years, people hid phonograph records, built hidden radios to catch Western broadcasts, and kept the music alive. Jazz became a form of quiet resistance. In the 1920s, the Bolsheviks believed professional journalists were elitist. Their solution: turn every worker into a correspondent. Factories had their own newspapers written by laborers. Millions of ordinary citizens became worker correspondents. The theory was beautiful. Why have a professional class interpreting workers' lives when workers could tell their own stories? Reality was messier. Many worker correspondents were barely literate, and tragically, during Stalin's purges, worker correspondents who reported on corruption were arrested as enemies of the state. This sounds like science fiction, but it's documented fact. In the 1920s, Soviet biologist Ilya Ivanov received government funding to create human-chimpanzee hybrids. The goal: to prove evolution, demonstrate Soviet scientific superiority, and possibly create super-strong workers. Ivanov traveled to Africa and attempted to artificially inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. The experiments failed. Undeterred, he then tried to convince Soviet women to volunteer for insemination with ape sperm. A few reportedly agreed, but the experiments were shut down before they could proceed. Ivanov was eventually arrested during Stalin's purges and died in exile in Kazakhstan. This wasn't some fringe lunacy. This was a state-funded project, approved at high levels. Ironically, Stalin, who would later become notorious for deportations and ethnic persecution, initially promoted a relatively progressive nationality policy. The Soviets created autonomous regions for different ethnic groups, supported native languages, and promoted local cultures. They established alphabets for dozens of languages that had never been written before. They funded publications in Uzbek, Kazakh, Ukrainian, Georgian languages the Tsars had suppressed. Of course, Stalin would later betray these principles spectacularly. In 1917, only about 40% of Russians could read. By 1939, literacy was nearly universal. This is one of the USSR's most impressive achievements. The Bolsheviks believed an illiterate population couldn't build socialism, so they mobilized the entire state. Teachers went to the most remote villages. Factories held reading classes. The Red Army taught soldiers to read. Literacy became a patriotic duty. Was there propaganda in the textbooks? Of course, but millions of people learned to read who would otherwise have remained illiterate their entire lives. Here's an irony that would be funny if it were unso dark. Stalin murdered more devoted communists than existed in all of America during the Red Scare. The Great Purge of 1936-1938 didn't just target enemies of communism, it devoured the Communist Party itself. Old Bolsheviks who de-risked their lives in the revolution were dragged from their beds at 3 a.m. and shot in basement rooms. About half of all Communist Party members were arrested or executed. Nearly every member of Lenin's original government was murdered. The personal stories are haunting. Men would be arrested, tortured into confessing to being British spies, then shot. Their wives would then be arrested for being married to an enemy of the people. Their children would be sent to orphanages and taught to denounce their parents. The secret police didn't just arrest people randomly. They had systematic plans with specific numerical quotas. The head executioner at one Moscow facility, Vasily Blakin. He wore a leather butcher's apron to keep the blood off his uniform and would shoot prisoners one after another in a basement room. Methodically, like a job on an assembly line, Blakin was rewarded for his efficiency. He received medals and promotions. The Soviets treated mass murder as an industrial process to be optimized. The paranoia created a horrible feedback loop. People knew they might be arrested at any moment, for any reason or no reason. So some decided their best protection was to denounce others first to prove their loyalty by finding enemies. Citizens would inform on neighbors, colleagues, even family members. Often these denunciations were based on nothing, a misheard comment, a grudge, pure invention. But once accused, a person was usually doomed. This created a society where trust became impossible. You couldn't speak freely, even to close friends. Parents warned children to be careful what they said at school. During the worst of the terror and famine, Soviet officials created Potemkin villages on steroids. Foreign visitors and journalists would be taken to special model farms and towns where everything was clean, well-stocked, and prosperous. What they didn't know, the workers were NKVD agents, acting roles. The store shelves were stocked only for the visit. The smiling children were coached. After the visitors left, everything was packed up and moved to the next location. Some Western intellectuals visited these showplaces and returned home convinced Soviet propaganda was truth. They wrote books praising the USSR while millions starved. Before Photoshop, there was Soviet photograph editing. When Stalin purged someone, that person had to disappear, not just from life, but from history. Technicians would meticulously retouch photographs, removing purged officials from historical images. The most famous example, a photograph of Lenin addressing a crowd, originally showed Trotsky standing nearby. After Trotsky's exile and assassination, he was airbrushed out. This happened thousands of times. Reality became fluid. The past was whatever Stalin said it was. During Stalin's era, ideology often trumped evidence. Trofim Lysenko claimed he could make crops grow in any climate through ideological conviction. No bourgeois genetics needed. Stalin loved this because it fit Marxist theory. Lysenko became director of the Institute of Genetics. Meanwhile, real geneticists were denounced as fascists and arrested. Soviet genetics was set back decades. Crops failed. Famines worsened. But Lysenko kept his position because his theories were politically correct. Lavrentiy Beria, as head of the NKVD, was one of the most powerful men in the USSR. He organized mass arrests, executions, and deportations. He ran the Gulag system. He oversaw the Soviet nuclear program. He was also a serial rapist who used his position to abduct, rape, and sometimes murder women and girls. His guards would stop attractive women on Moscow streets, claim they were needed for questioning, and deliver them to Beria's mansion. Many never returned. After Stalin's death, when Beria was finally arrested and executed, mass graves were found on his property. What makes this even more horrifying, everyone in the Soviet leadership knew. In 1932-33, Stalin's forced collectivization policies and deliberate grain seizures created a famine in Ukraine that killed somewhere between 3 and 7 million people. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Soviet forces confiscated grain from Ukrainian villages, leaving people to starve. They set up checkpoints to prevent people from leaving affected areas. People ate grass, tree bark, and dirt. There are documented cases of cannibalism. Meanwhile, The Soviet Union was exporting grain. While Ukrainians starved, Soviet grain ships left Black Sea ports bound for foreign markets. Walter Duranty of the New York Times wrote dispatches denying the famine even as he privately told colleagues millions were dying. He won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting that helped Stalin hide genocide. Stalin didn't just kill individuals, he erased entire peoples from their homelands. During World War II and after, he deported entire ethnic groups he suspected of disloyalty. The Chechens, Ingish, Crimean Tatars, Kalmyks, and others. Millions of people were rounded up, often with just hours' notice, packed into cattle cars, and shipped thousands of miles to Kazakhstan, Siberia, or Central Asia. These were entire populations, elderly, children, pregnant women, everyone. They were simply dumped in remote locations with no food, shelter, or infrastructure. Many died during the journey. More died after arrival. The Chechens lost about a quarter of their population. If you've ever seen photos of Moscow metro stations, you know they're breathtakingly beautiful. Marble columns, ornate chandeliers, mosaics, sculptures, they look like palaces. Stalin called them palaces for the people. Here's what they do untell you. They were built largely by gulag prisoners and volunteer labor that was remotely voluntary. Thousands died in construction accidents, cave-ins, and from the brutal working conditions. The juxtaposition is quintessentially Soviet. Create something beautiful through suffering. Claim it proves the system's benevolence. Ignore the bones buried in the foundation. Yakov Jugashvili, Stalin's eldest son, was captured by the Germans in 1941. The Nazis offered to trade him for German prisoners. Stalin refused, stating, "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Stalin's coldness toward his own son exemplified his worldview. Personal relationships meant nothing compared to political calculation. Yakov died in a German POW camp. The truth only emerged after Stalin's death. In Stalin's final years, his paranoia focused increasingly on Jews. The Doctor's Plot of 1952-53 saw prominent Jewish physicians accused of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. It was the opening move of what many historians believe would have been a massive deportation of Soviet Jews. Documents suggest plans were being drawn up to relocate Jews to Siberia, similar to the ethnic deportations of the 1940s. Then, on March 5, 1953, Stalin suffered a massive stroke and died. His death may have prevented the deportation of over 2 million Soviet Jews. After World War II, both the Soviets and Americans scrambled to capture German rocket scientists. The Americans got Wernher von Braun, the Soviets got everyone else. Soviet forces rounded up hundreds of German engineers, scientists, and technicians, along with their families, and shipped them to the USSR. They were housed in special closed cities, given comfortable accommodations, and told to build rockets. The Germans trained Soviet engineers and transferred all their knowledge. Within a decade, the Soviets had surpassed their German tutors and were launching satellites, while America struggled to get rockets off the launch pad. Everyone knows Laika, the first dog in space, died on Sputnik 2. What most don't know, her death wasn't an accident. There was never any plan to bring her back. The spacecraft had no re-entry capability. Soviet propaganda initially claimed she survived several days. The truth, revealed decades later, she died within hours from overheating and stress. The scientist who trained Laika said years later, "We shouldn't have done it. We did not learn enough from the mission." to justify the death of the dog. Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, wasn't the obvious choice. He was selected partly because of his size at 5 feet 2. He fit well in the cramped Vostok capsule, but also because of his personality, cheerful, charismatic, politically reliable. The real favorite was German Titov, considered the better pilot and more intelligent. But Gagarin was a peasant's son from a small village, the perfect Soviet everyman. If something went wrong, better to lose the charming peasant than the talented aristocrat. His famous Poyak, "Let's go," as the rocket launched became one of the most iconic phrases of the 20th century. Venus is hell. Surface temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric pressure 90 times Earth's. Clouds of sulfuric acid. When Soviet scientists designed probes to land there in the 1960s and 70s, they knew survival time would be measured in minutes. Venera 7 transmitted for 23 minutes before failing. Venera 9 and 10 sent back the first images from another planet's surface, fuzzy, strange photographs of rocks under a dim sky before dying. But in those brief transmissions, they revolutionized our understanding of planetary science. It was a triumph of engineering, designing a spacecraft that could function, even briefly, in conditions that would vaporize any known Earth metal. Soviet spacecraft had a survival kit that included a shotgun, not a space weaponer modified hunting rifle for after landing. Why? Because Siberia is enormous, and spacecraft don't always land where you want them to. The TP-8 to survival pistol was a combination shotgun rifle with 3 barrels, designed to kill animals and signal for rescue. It came with a machete attachment. One cosmonaut, Alexei Leonov, used his to hunt game while waiting 3 days for rescue after landing in the Ural Mountains forest. Imagine, you've just returned from space, and your immediate concern is fending off bears. The Soviet Union had at least 40 closed cities, entire municipalities that officially didn't exist. No road signs pointed to them. They weren't on maps. Their residents couldn't tell anyone where they lived. These were atomic cities, scientific research centers, and weapons facilities. Artemis 16 was where Soviet nuclear weapons were designed. Residents needed special permission to enter or leave, but life inside could be quite comfortable. Closed cities had priority for food supplies, better housing, and superior schools. The bizarre result: there were places in the Soviet Union where life was better than anywhere else in the country, but those places officially didn't exist, and if you lived there, you couldn't tell anyone. In the 1930s, Soviet scientist Sergei Yudin pioneered the use of cadaver blood for transfusions. He theorized that blood from recently deceased people could be used if collected quickly. During World War II, when blood was desperately needed for wounded soldiers, Soviet medical units collected blood from battlefield casualties, dead Soviet soldiers, blood used to save living ones. Western medicine was horrified. Soviet medicine called it pragmatic. Yudin saved countless lives. His career ended. Tragically, he was arrested during Stalin's purges in 1948. He spent years in the Gulag before being released after Stalin's death. During the 872-day siege of Leningrad, over 1 million civilians died of starvation. At the Vavilov Institute, scientists guarded a seed bank of 250,000 samples of seeds, roots, and fruits from around the world. These seeds were edible. The scientists were starving. Some had bags of rice and potatoes in their labs, enough to survive on for months. They didn't eat them. At least 9 scientists died of starvation rather than consume the seeds they were protecting. They understood these specimens were irreplaceable, crucial for future agricultural research. Their own lives mattered less than preserving genetic diversity for humanity. This is one of the most profound acts of scientific dedication in history. In 1970 and 1973, the USSR landed 2 Lunokhod rovers on the Moon, the first remote-controlled vehicles on another world. American rovers wouldn't reach Mars until decades later. They were driven in real time by teams of operators in Soviet mission control. The operators used periscope-like devices to see the Moon's surface and had to navigate obstacles and avoid craters, all while dealing with the time delay of signals traveling to the Moon and back. Lunokhod 1 traveled 10.5 kilometers over 11 months, far exceeding its planned lifespan. While Western computers used binary 0 south and 1 south, some Soviet computers experimented with ternary logic 1, 0, 1. The Seton computer, built in the late 1950s, was the world's most successful ternary computer. The theory was sound. Ternary is mathematically more efficient than binary. But binary had advantages in practical engineering that made it the global standard. The Seton worked, was reliable, and was used for over a decade. In 1963, Soviet engineer Leonid Kupryanovich demonstrated a mobile phone weighing 70 grams with a range of 30 kilometers. This was years before any Western equivalent. The problem? It was basically a fancy radio. There was no network, no infrastructure for actual mobile telephony. This pattern repeated throughout Soviet tech history. Brilliant individual innovations that never scaled into practical systems because the instabilized economy could uncommercialize them. The USSR produced Nobel Prize-winning scientists while struggling to manufacture decent refrigerators. In a system where official shops were often empty, but everyone needed goods, Soviets created BLAT, a complex informal economy of favors, connections, and barter. BLAT wasn't quite bribery and wasn't quite capitalism. It was reciprocal exchange through personal networks. You knew someone who worked at a shoe factory who could get you nice boots. In exchange, you'd use your position at a restaurant to save good cuts of meat for them. Every Soviet citizen cultivated BLAT networks. Your social capital was measured not by wealth, but by connections. Levi's jeans became contraband, worth more than a month's salary. Young Soviets would pay 150 to 200 rubles for authentic American jeans, this when average monthly salary was maybe 120 rubles. Why? Partly quality Soviet clothing was notoriously poor, but mostly because jeans represented forbidden Western culture. Wearing Levi's was a small act of rebellion, a connection to the wider world. The Soviet government alternately cracked down on and tolerated jean wearing. The government's confusion about how to handle denim perfectly captured their helplessness against the appeal of Western popular culture. Every typewriter in the USSR had to be registered with the KGB. Typewriter shops kept samples of text from each machine. If samizdat self-published material appeared, authorities could potentially match it to a specific typewriter. Owning an unregistered typewriter was illegal. Some dissidents would type at night with windows closed, muffling the sound with blankets, paranoid that neighbors might report the suspicious clatter. The result? Soviet citizens developed elaborate systems to share information without leaving traces. They memorized poems rather than writing them down. They created hand-copied books, each page laboriously transcribed. Soviet citizens developed a rich tradition of political jokes that mocked the system in ways direct criticism never could. Sample joke. What's the difference between capitalism and socialism? In capitalism, man exploits man. In socialism, it's the other way around. These jokes were pressure valves, allowing people to express frustration safely as long as you told them to the right people. Tell the wrong person, and you could face arrest. The KGB took humor very seriously. You can arrest critics, but you can't arrest laughter. In the 1920s and 30s, many families were forced into communal apartments, where multiple families shared one apartment, each family occupying a single room. Privacy was impossible. Everyone shared one kitchen, one bathroom. Fights over cleaning schedules and cooking times were constant. You could hear everything your neighbors did through thin walls. This was partly due to housing shortages, but also ideologically motivated. Private family life was bourgeois. Communal living was socialist. The reality was misery. The Soviet economy suffered from chronic deficit, perpetual shortages of everything. Not because goods didn't exist, but because centralized planning couldn't match production to demand. Shops would suddenly receive a shipment of, say, pressure cookers. Word would spread through informal networks. Within hours, lines would form. People would buy multiple pressure cookers, not because they needed them, but because they were available and could be traded later. Shrewd Soviets learned to never pass up an opportunity to buy anything of quality, whether they needed it or not. Soviet consumer electronics were notoriously unreliable. The most infamous problem: televisions that would spontaneously catch fire or explode. The Rubin 714 television had a design flaw that caused it to overheat. Thousands of apartments burned because of TV fires. Soviet families developed the habit of unplugging TVs when not in use. Some kept fire extinguishers near their television sets. Fed up with the black market for Western jeans, the Soviet government decided to manufacture their own. In the 1970s, they began producing jeans in state factories. The results were comically bad. Soviet jeans were stiff, uncomfortable, poorly dyed, and fell apart quickly. They looked wrong to baggy, or too tight. The dye ran, turning skin blue. Young Soviets rejected them completely. It became a symbol of the Soviet Union's inability to produce what its own citizens actually wanted. Soviet citizens couldn't just move to a new city. Your internal passport had a propiska registration to live in a specific place. Moving required permission, which was often denied. This system prevented rural citizens from flooding into Moscow or Leningrad. Jews faced particular restrictions. They were often denied propiska for major cities. Getting Moscow propiska was so valuable that people married for it. Foreigners would pay Soviet citizens to enter sham marriages just to get the right stamp in their passport, while ordinary Soviets stood in lines for low-quality goods. Communist Party officials shopped at special stores, Berezovka stocked with Western imports and quality Soviet products unavailable to the general public. The elite lived differently. They had better apartments in better neighborhoods. This created a new aristocracy in the supposedly classless society. The ultimate Soviet irony, a system built to eliminate inequality, created its own privileged class based on party position. Ordinary Soviets knew about these privileges and resented them. In the USSR, unemployment officially didn't exist. Everyone had to work. If you didn't, you were a parasite living off society, and you could be arrested. The poet Joseph Brodsky was convicted of parasitism in 1964 because poetry wasn't considered real work. He was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Arctic. This seems insane. Arrested for not working. But in Soviet logic, if everyone must contribute to society, refusing to work was ideological subversion. In the 1950s and 60s, Western rock music was banned, but Soviet youth desperately wanted it. Enterprising bootleggers discovered discarded X-ray films could be used to record music. They'd get used X-rays from hospitals, often images of bones, which is why they called the records bone music. Imagine buying an illegal Elvis record printed on someone's chest X-ray. Soviet authorities knew about bone music, but struggled to stop it. X-rays were medical waste. How do you criminalize possession of medical waste? The USSR spanned 11 actual time zones, but official policy minimized the number of zones to simplify central planning. This created absurdities. People in Far Eastern regions would go to work in darkness because their clock said 9 a.m., even though the sun would rise for hours. This perfectly captured Soviet governance: impose uniformity from the center regardless of practical reality. When Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, the government initially claimed they were there at the Afghan government's invitation to help with modernization. They denied it was a war. Soviet families didn't know their sons were dying in combat. Casualties were hidden. Soldiers weren't called soldiers, but limited contingent. It took months for the truth to emerge. Over 9 years, about 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. Veterans returned home to a society that didn't acknowledge what they'd been through. There were no parades, no recognition. Many suffered PTSD without support. Afghanistan was the world's largest opium producer. Soviet soldiers, traumatized and bored, often had easy access to drugs. Addiction rates soared. Soldiers would trade ammunition, equipment, even weapons, to local Afghans for drugs. When addicted soldiers returned to the USSR, they brought their habits with them. Heroin use spread through Soviet cities in the 1980s. The early years went relatively well for Soviet forces. Then, in 1986, the CIA began supplying Stinger missiles, portable surface-doer weapons that could take down helicopters. Suddenly, Soviet air superiority evaporated. The Stingers changed the war's trajectory. They significantly increased the cost of Soviet operations and made victory impossible. Tragically, many of those Stingers later ended up in the hands of Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he genuinely believed Soviet socialism could be reformed. He didn't intend to end the USSR, he wanted to save it. Glasnost openness was supposed to allow limited criticism. Perestroika, restructuring, was supposed to make the economy more efficient. Neither worked as intended. Once you allow a little openness, you can't control it. Soviet citizens, given the chance to speak, aired decades of grievances. Partial economic reforms created chaos. Shops emptied. Inflation soared. Gorbachev was like a dam engineer who poked a small hole to relieve pressure, only to watch the entire structure crumble. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. It was the worst nuclear disaster in history. The Soviet government's first instinct: deny it happened. For days, authorities said nothing while radioactive clouds drifted across Europe. In Ukraine, authorities told no one. People went about their lives, breathing radioactive air. In Pripyat, residents weren't evacuated for 36 hours. When evacuation finally came, authorities told residents they'd return in a few days. They never did. Pripyat remains abandoned, a radioactive ghost town. After the explosion, someone had to contain the damage. The Soviet government mobilized hundreds of thousands of liquidators, soldiers, firefighters, miners, volunteers. Many were given minimal or no protective equipment. They were told radiation levels were safe when they weren't. The immediate death toll was officially 31. The real toll from radiation exposure is unknown. Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands. Some liquidators knew they were being sent to their deaths. Others were lied to. Many were motivated by genuine heroism. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and BBC Russian service were forbidden but widely listened to. Soviets would huddle around radios at night, tuning through static to hear uncensored news. When Gorbachev announced glasnost, many Soviet citizens first heard about it from Western broadcasts. Soviet media initially continued censoring sensitive topics, even as policy changed. In August 1989, about 2 million people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania linked hands, forming a 600-kilometer human chain called the Baltic Way. It was a peaceful protest demanding independence from the USSR. The image of millions holding hands across 3 countries was powerful propaganda against Soviet rule. The Baltic Way demonstrated that the Soviet Union had lost control. Within 2 years, all 3 Baltic states would be independent. Boris Yeltsin, who would become Russia's first post-Soviet president, was known for his drinking. At a 1994 state visit to Berlin, Yeltsin got drunk and grabbed a conductor's baton during an official dinner, attempting to conduct the orchestra. At another event in Washington, he was found in his underwear on Pennsylvania Avenue, trying to hail a cab to get pizza. These weren't isolated incidents. Yeltsin's drinking was chronic and often public. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a hunting lodge in Belarus. They signed the Belovezha Accords, declaring the Soviet Union dissolved. They didn't ask permission. They didn't hold a referendum. 3 men signed a document and ended a superpower. Gorbachev learned about it from news reports. He was furious but powerless. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. Western narrative assumes everyone celebrated Soviet dissolution. Reality was complicated. Many Soviet citizens, especially older ones, grieved. The USSR, for all its faults, had provided stability. There was full employment, guaranteed housing, free healthcare, and education. The 1990s brought chaos. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Unemployment appeared. Crime exploded. Even today, significant minorities in former Soviet republics express nostalgia for the USSR. The USSR's dissolution was the largest peaceful redrawing of national boundaries in history. 15 Soviet socialist republics became 15 independent nations. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Most had no experience with independence. Border disputes immediately erupted. Within months, wars started. The Soviet collapse unleashed forces that continue reshaping Eurasia today. Despite censorship, Soviet filmmakers created extraordinary art. Sergei Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin pioneered montage techniques still taught in film schools. Andrei Tarkovsky's philosophical films like Solaris and Stalker are considered among cinema's greatest achievements. Soviet directors learned to encode criticism in metaphor and symbolism. Censors often missed subtext that audiences understood perfectly. Dmitri Shostakovich was one of the 20th century's greatest composers. He was also a Soviet citizen living under Stalin's terror. In 1936, Stalin walked out of Shostakovich's opera. Days later, Pravda published a devastating review titled "Muddle" instead of music. This was essentially a death sentence. Shostakovich waited for the knock on the door. He slept in the stairwell so his family wouldn't witness his arrest. The arrest never came. Instead, he composed his Fifth Symphony. It premiered to thunderous applause. But listeners heard something else in the music: anguish, terror, forced jubilation, hiding despair. As party lines changed, history had to be rewritten. Textbooks were constantly revised to match current ideology. Teachers received urgent directives: remove pages, paste in replacement pages, destroy the originals. Students would come to class to find their textbooks had changed overnight. This created generations with fragmented historical understanding. When the state controlled all printing presses, dissidents created semistats, self-published literature. Someone would type a manuscript, making multiple carbon copies. Each reader would copy it again, passing it along. Major works of literature circulated this way: Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. Books that couldn't be officially published spread through underground networks. People risked prison to preserve literature. The KGB knew about Samizdat, but couldn't stop it. Soviet ballet was arguably the world's finest. The Bolshoi and Mariinsky companies produced legendary dancers: Rudolf Nureyev, Mikhail Baryshnikov, Natalia Makarova. The state invested heavily in ballet training, but dancers who defected to the West were declared traitors. Their families faced consequences. Yet they kept defecting because artistic freedom mattered more than material comfort. Soviet propaganda was sophisticated visual communication. Posters from the 1920s-30s used bold colors, dynamic composition, and striking imagery. Artists like Alexander Rodchenko created revolutionary designs that influenced global graphic design. Even knowing the reality behind the propaganda, the art itself is often stunning. The Soviet state was officially atheist and actively suppressed religion. They created museums of atheism in former churches. The League of Militant Atheists, at its peak, had millions of members. Yet religion persisted. Churches were destroyed, but people prayed in secret. By the 1980s, the anti-religious campaign had largely failed. Soviet Olympic dominance wasn't just about good training, it was often about performance-enhancing drugs. Athletes were given drugs, often without their knowledge or consent. Many Olympians suffered long-term health consequences. This pattern continues in Russia today. Soviet sci-fi existed in a strange space, officially supporting socialism, but often subtly questioning it. The Strugatsky brothers wrote novels that used alien contact as metaphor for Soviet stagnation. Censors struggled with sci-fi because metaphors were deniable. Chess wasn't just a game in the USSR, it was Cold War weaponry. Soviet chess dominance demonstrated intellectual superiority. When Bobby Fischer defeated Boris Spassky in 1972, it was treated as national humiliation. By the 1970s-80s, Soviet rock bands were playing in underground venues. Viktor Tsoi and his band Kino became icons of Soviet counterculture. These bands operated in legal gray zones. Soviet rock was rawer and more politically charged than Western rock. When you risk arrest for your art, the art gains urgency. Every summer, millions of Soviet children attended pioneer camps, weeks of outdoor activities, sports, arts and crafts, and political education. These camps created powerful memories. Many former Soviets remember their pioneer camp experiences fondly. Even matchbooks carried ideology. Soviet matchbook labels promoted safety slogans, celebrated achievements, showed industrial scenes. The Soviet citizen's life was saturated with ideological imagery. The effect was both powerful and numbing. Constant propaganda became background noise. The main administration of Camps Gulag wasn't just a prison system, it was an economic empire. Millions of prisoners mined gold, cut timber, built infrastructure, and manufactured goods. Gulag labor built the White Sea Canal and countless construction projects. Prisoners worked in extreme conditions with minimal food and no safety equipment. Hundreds of thousands died. The Kolyma region in far northeastern Siberia was the deadliest Gulag destination. Temperatures reached -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Summer lasted 6 weeks. Prisoners mined gold in these conditions, working outdoors in thin clothing, fed starvation rations. In Kolyma, survival was measured in months. Estimates suggest that of the millions sent to Kolyma, perhaps 10 to 20% survived. The Soviets had special Gulag facilities where imprisoned scientists worked on weapons and nuclear projects. The most famous was the Sharashka, a relatively comfortable prison where technical prisoners did research. These prisoners had better food and heat than regular Gulag inmates. But they were still prisoners, still separated from families, still subject to arbitrary execution. When pregnant women were sentenced to the Gulag, they gave birth in camps. Mothers could keep their babies for about 2 years. Then the state took the children and sent them to orphanages. Many mothers never reunited with their children. Soviet prison tattoos were a complex language. Each symbol had meaning. This criminal culturvory vis economus, a parallel power structure in gulags. Criminal leaders often had more practical authority than guards. Political prisoners were often at the mercy of criminals. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's massive 3-volume expose of the Gulag system couldn't be published in the USSR. Dissidents photographed each page onto microfilm. The film was smuggled out. When published in the West in 1973, it was a sensation. The Soviet government arrested Solzhenitsyn, then forcibly deported him to West Germany. Completing your sentence didn't guarantee freedom. Many prisoners were rearrested on new charges immediately upon release. This created permanent underclasses of former prisoners. The sentence might end, but the punishment continued for life. If you criticized the Soviet system, you must be insane. That was the official logic. Critics were diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia and committed to psychiatric hospitals. Patients were forcibly medicated with drugs that caused awful side effects. They could be held indefinitely without trial. Women comprised about 15% of Gulag prisoners. They faced all the hardships men did, plus sexual violence from guards and male prisoners. Women worked the same brutal jobs as men: logging, mining, construction. The Soviet state showed no mercy based on age or gender. Many who survived the Gulag returned home and never spoke of what they endured. The trauma was too deep. Entire families lived with the knowledge that grandmother or grandfather had been in the Gulag, but never discussed it. The silence became a kind of inherited trauma. Khrushchev closed most gulags and released many political prisoners during the thaw. But the system did, entirely disappear it. transformed into corrective labor colonies that continued until the Soviet collapse. Even today, Russia maintains labor colonies where prisoners work in difficult conditions. After Lenin died in 1924, Soviet authorities wanted to preserve him. But some scientists wanted more. They wanted to eventually revive him. Soviet research into cryonics and suspended animation was partly motivated by the dream of resurrecting Lenin when technology advanced. The research was serious science conducted by respected institutes. While signing treaties banning biological weapons, the Soviet Union ran a massive covert bioweapons program. They weaponized anthrax, plague, and smallpox. In 1979, an accidental release from a bioweapons facility in Sverdlovsk killed at least 66 people. The Soviet government claimed it was contaminated meat. The truth only emerged after the USSR collapsed. Soviet research into consciousness included brutal sleep deprivation experiments. Subjects were kept awake for weeks using stimulants. After about 5 days without sleep, subjects experienced hallucinations and paranoia. After 2 weeks, some became permanently psychotic. The Soviet Union constructed massive ELF, extremely low-frequency radio facilities, ostensibly for submarine communication. But conspiracy theories swirled about their real purpose, the truth. They were primarily for communicating with submarines, but the Soviets also researched whether ELF waves could affect weather patterns or human consciousness. In the 1950s, Vladimir Demikov grafted the head and front legs of a puppy onto an adult dog, creating a 2-headed animal. Both heads could see, hear, and react independently. The creature survived for weeks. This wasn't sadism. Demikov was researching organ transplantation, but the 2-headed dog experiments were ethically appalling. Before the International Space Station, the Soviet Union operated a series of space stations, starting with Salyut in 1971. Mir, launched in 1986, was a remarkable achievement, a permanently crewed space station that operated for 15 years. Life on Mir could be dangerous. In 1997, a fire broke out. Later that year, an unmanned supply ship collided with Mir, nearly causing explosive decompression. The TP-82 was a triple-barreled combination pistol with 2 shotgun barrels and 1 rifle barrel. It came with a machete that doubled as a buttstock. Cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Pavel Belayov landed in the Ural forest in 1965, 600 miles off course. They heard wolves and bears while waiting 2 days for rescue. After that, Soviet spacecraft carried weapons. In 1968, before any human had traveled beyond low Earth orbit, the Soviet Zond 5 spacecraft carried tortoises around the moon and back to Earth. The tortoises survived, becoming the first living creatures to travel around the moon. This happened months before Apollo 8's crewed lunar orbit. The Soviet military funded research into creating enhanced soldiers, humans with improved strength, endurance, and cognitive abilities. Most experiments failed. Some were fraudulent. Some were genuinely dangerous. The dream of the Soviet supersoldier never materialized. In a system with chronic shortages, money alone was worthless. What mattered was access, knowing someone at a store who'd save good cuts of meat, having connections to farmers. This created an invisible hierarchy based on connections rather than income. A factory worker with good BLAT networks could eat better than a poorly connected engineer earning 3 times as much. Soviet cookbooks were surreal documents. They de-feature elaborate recipes requiring ingredients like fresh pineapple or quality chocolate that had been available in stores for years. The Book of Tasty and Healthy Food described dishes most readers would never eat. It served as propaganda look at the abundant food Soviet socialism provides, even as readers knew it was fiction. Soviet citizens spent hours daily standing in queues, lines for bread, lines for milk, lines for shoes, lines to pay bills. People developed strategies, sending family members to hold spots in multiple lines simultaneously, marking your place and leaving to run other errands. The experience of standing in endless lines shaped Soviet psychology. It taught patience, but also resignation. While ordinary Soviets waited in lines, party officials shopped at closed distribution centers with ample supplies of quality goods. This parallel economy for the privileged was one of communism's great hypocrisies. The supposedly classless society had a class system based on party loyalty. During various periods, the USSR instituted strict rationing. You'd receive coupons for specific quantities of bread, meat, sugar, cloth. Even when not officially rationed, stores would limit purchases: 1 chicken per customer, 1 pair of shoes per person. Official alcohol was often scarce or expensive. So many Soviets distilled their own Samagon moonshine made from sugar, potatoes, or whatever was available. Samagon production was technically illegal, but widely practiced. The quality ranged from decent vodka equivalents to poisonous brews that caused blindness or death. This is one of communism's central paradoxes. The USSR had vast agricultural land and resources, yet couldn't reliably feed its population. Collectivization destroyed agricultural productivity. Farmers had no incentive to produce beyond quotas. The result, a country that could have been a food exporter, chronically importing grain from abroad to prevent starvation. When the USSR collapsed and the distribution system failed, millions survived using Docha's small garden plots where families grew vegetables and fruit. This was ironic. The system that had collectivized agriculture ended with citizens returning to subsistence farming on tiny personal plots. So there you have it, 101 facts about the Soviet Union that complicate everything you thought you knew. The Soviet Union was a contradiction machine. It gave us Gagarin and the Gulag, Shostakovich and Stalin, ballet dancers and bioweapons, universal literacy and universal surveillance. It tried to create a new type of human and instead revealed how resilient humanity is to being remade. For 70 years, 1/6 of the world's land surface was governed by an idea that human nature could be engineered, that society could be perfected through willpower and planning, that a better world was possible if only the right people had enough control. It failed. But in failing, it taught us something crucial, that human systems are human, and humans are beautifully, frustratingly, eternally complicated. We can't be reduced to economic theories or 5-year plans. We resist being categorized, controlled, perfected. The Soviet experiment ended in 1991, but its echoes continue. In Russia's current government, in debates about socialism and capitalism, in our understanding of what government can and can't do, in the lives of millions who lived through it and carry those memories. The real Soviet Union wasn't the cartoon villain of Western imagination. It was 293 million people trying to live their lives in an extraordinary historical moment. Some were heroes, some were villains, most were just human. Remember them, remember their stories, because the only way we learn from history is by seeing it, clearly not through propaganda, but through the messy, complicated, fascinating reality of what actually happened. Sleep well. Dream of cosmonauts and dissidents, of dancers and scientists, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in impossible times. The Soviet Union is gone, but the lessons remain.